Hello and welcome. Before I introduce my guest, Professor Mona Baker from the University of Manchester, I'd first like to introduce myself. My name's Dr. Morven Beaton-Tomey, and I'm a lecturer in Interpreting and Translation Studies, also at the Centre for Translation and Intercultural Studies at the University of Manchester. Mona, I'd like to talk to you today about the second edition of In Other Words. I think that you yourself really need no introduction. You're a prominent figure in the field of translation studies. To mention a few of your publications: Critical Readings in Translation Studies, the Routledge Encyclopedia of Translation Studies, the 4-volume Translation Studies, and of course your monograph Translation and Conflict. Second edition of In Other Words, what prompted you to bring out another edition of the 1992 book?
Well, the first edition, as you know, came out in 1992, so that's nearly 10 years ago. It's a long time in the life of a discipline. Much has changed during that period. For a start, we weren't a discipline in 1992. I remember when back in the late 80s, when I wanted to do an MA in translation studies, I couldn't find one within reach. Today, just about every institution around the world offers several different MAs in translation and interpreting. So today we are a discipline, and that's a major change. It changes a lot of the ways in which we think about what we do, and it changes our level of accountability, and it changes the level of resources that are needed for servicing a large number of students. And so, encouraged by Routledge, by the publisher, I decided to revisit what I did 10 years ago and to try and bring it more in line with what was happening today, both in the discipline and also in the professional world of translation and interpreting.
If we could just focus in on those changes. You talked about a number of changes that have happened in the discipline and in the professional practice of translation and interpreting. Could you maybe mention a few of those that we could explore in a little more detail?
Yeah. As far as the discipline is concerned, as I already mentioned, there are just far more training courses than there used to be. And so this is a major change. In terms of the professional world itself, and of course that is reflected in the kind of courses that are on offer, there is, for example, the shift towards relying more heavily on visual material and integrating visual and verbal material in things like newspaper material, promotional leaflets, the growth of audiovisual translation. Today we are very much a visual culture, and the visual element is almost always there. You hardly ever now translate purely verbal stretches of text. There's always some visual element that you have to take on board. For example, a lot of translators now translate web pages, which are very dynamic, which have moving pictures, which sometimes also have sound. And of course the changes in technology as well have supported this kind of shift. And translators have to be far more versatile than they used to be in taking on board not just the textual stretches that they're translating, but the relationship between the text and the visual material, which is part of what they're delivering. They have to know how to work with technology. They have to be able to work with a very different set of genre from the ones that they worked with 10 years ago. And these are all things that I've tried to take on board and are reflected in the second edition.
I think it's an interesting point that you talk about translators having to be much more versatile in terms of how they approach their work and indeed critically reflect on that work. And I think one of the things that it has become clearer and clearer as we move on is the constraints that translators are placed under in terms of subtitling constraints, for example, or other types of textual constraints that they face. In a way then, I think the approach that you had originally in 1992, a sort of description-based approach rather than a prescription-based approach, is indeed extendable to these kinds of texts, where, for example, a strategy for literary translation in terms of explicitation may be quite different than that in subtitling, for example.
Indeed,
So that kind of covers, if you like, the different kinds of texts that translators face. Are there any other changes to the book itself that you would like to talk about?
Yes, some of the changes, obviously the types of changes I was talking about are reflected in the range of new genre that are included in both to exemplify strategies, to exemplify theoretical notions like collocation, plays on idioms, and also to include in the exercises at the end of each chapter. So you have things like material from YouTube, videos, for instance, screenshots. We have web pages in the new edition for as exercises to be worked on. We have material from newspaper outlets that are translated regularly into a lot of languages, like The Economist, like Cosmopolitan, and so on. Other changes that are reflected in the new edition include the embedding of the text, all the texts, in the body of the book itself. So in 1992, because of problems with technology, because we weren't as advanced technologically as we are now, I had to put a lot of the texts at the end of the book, which wasn't very user friendly, because as people worked with text or wanted to look at examples, they had to go back to the end of the book to look at Chinese examples or Japanese examples or Arabic examples. Today, because of advances in technology, I've been able to embed these in the body of the text, all of them, so there are no appendices. But Routledge have also done a number of things that have improved the user friendliness of the book. And so, for example, many of the examples of particular strategies that are used are put in boxes so that they are separated from the rest of the text and are much easier to find and work with. The exercises are put in kind of gray area at the end, again visually much easier to work with and much more user friendly. But other things that I have included here that weren't in the first edition are things like exercises or exemplification with things like comics, for example. Again, bringing in the visual and the verbal material together. And in some places, not many, but in some places I have tried to also incorporate material on interpreting, because interpreting today is far more important than it was 10 years ago. And the general thinking now is that interpreting and translation are really part of the same discipline.